Welcome. My name is Jen Barker, and I am the founder of Fixing Her Eyes. Anytime we gather, it's important for us to acknowledge country, and I thank Common Grace for their help and their advocacy in this space. We are gathering this afternoon on different lands, and I would like to acknowledge the Darug people, the traditional custodians of the land on which this online gathering is hosted today. The traditional custodians are caretakers on behalf of our Almighty Creator. We would also like to pay our respects to the elders past, present, future, or emerging. We acknowledge all Aboriginal peoples present with us online and that the Indigenous peoples of Australia were this nation's first theologians and teachers. Matthew 5, verse 14 to 16 says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Psalm 27 verse 1 says, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" And Psalm 119 verse 105 says, "Your word is a lamp for my feet, a light on my path." Before we start this afternoon's conversations, I would like to acknowledge the women who have shared their testimonies about how this theology of headship has played a substantial part in their abuse, who have done so because they don't want to see others go through what they have gone through, who want actions from those in church leadership to ensure all women and children who attend church can sit safely in their pews. Can I say this to them? Thank you. I honour you. You have done more than what you should have had to, and we know that this has come at significant pain and cost. You should not have to do anything else. Your stories have been recorded for history, and it's not your responsibility to fight for light and truth. We call you wildflowers for a reason. We are praying for you and believe that you will rise from the ashes, if you haven't already done so. I wanted to acknowledge the women and men who have gone before and fought for a place at the table for women and have been belittled and oppressed by men and sometimes by women. We, the church, have had the opportunity to have you lead us and to shine a light with you. I want to thank you for what you have done. Many of you have left Sydney to shine a light elsewhere. Your stories have been recorded for history, and it's not your responsibility to fight for light and truth. We see you. I want to acknowledge that this issue is not confined to Sydney Anglicans. There are good churches in the city, and we would encourage you to find them if your minister is not willing to re-examine and fully support the full equality and full inclusion of women. I am personally disappointed by men who have said that they have worked this all out for themselves, that they believe in full equality and have moved on. That is malprivilege. We need your support right now for justice. I am a woman of deep faith, a deep conviction, a woman who stands on the shoulders of men and women for generations who have by faith shone a light into the world in the name of Jesus, by being his voice, his hands, his feet on both sides of my family. It is a responsibility I take seriously, and I am privileged beyond measure. I have seen women preach in the school I attended, and despite never wanting to be on that platform myself, I've had it modelled to me that women can be gifted for that role. And when it's only to a sea of women, that is illogical, as men are missing out on that insight and teaching. I am a woman who believes that the Bible is precious and that having the help of the Spirit to help me read it is significant. The Bible has a radical message, but the church is too blind to see it. and I am enormously grieved by things that I have been hearing. And like the Reverend Melissa Lipset said last week, I believe God is too. To quote a book I was given recently, we've been fed a lie. Now, this session needs to have a trigger warning. This conversation may include Bible readings and discussion around topics such as sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, physical violence, and identity-based discrimination and harassment. I acknowledge that this content may be difficult, and I encourage you to care for your safety and your well-being. I have been told stories of ministers' wives who are expected to have sex with their husbands numerous times a week to service their sexual needs. Otherwise, if he strays, the blame is on her. I've heard stories like the one that Jacqueline Service shared the other day, who is not allowed to preach at her church, despite her obvious gifting. I've been told to be careful. I've been told to take my faith and God seriously by young and old men in suits on platforms and women in pews, or otherwise face eternal consequences. I know I'm not alone, and the hurt and damage inflicted on those who dare to question the theology of headship represents a dark moment in our history. Unity is not what we're calling for. We're calling for repentance, which will lead to true unity. We are calling for a serious look at the current condition of our church. This week has been a significant one. We've heard from those who have a place in church leadership across a number of denominations. We've heard from historians, theologians, researchers, journalists who listen to stories and analyse data, pastors, writers, psychologists. Now, may I say that this afternoon's session wasn't part of our original plan. This afternoon's session is because of what we have been hearing over the last 24 hours and beyond that. We have had people ask for further analysis of what is going on, in particular in the Anglican Church in Sydney, based on what Jeff Borden said on Thursday night. Now, the DV task force, when looking at domestic and family violence, despite having the testimonies of women in front of them, were not allowed to look at whether their doctrine of headship played a part. Kevin Giles, in his book, The Headship of Men and the Abuse of Women, last year, quoted the principal of Moore College and one of the Sydney bishops, who also gave this year's presidential address. It was also reported in the ABC at the time. And I quote, "But several men spoke against the motion, including Reverend Mark Thompson, the head of Moore Theological College and chair of the Doctrine Commission. While domestic violence was never justifiable, Reverend Thompson said, the issue of divorce and remarriage required time and careful study of Bible passages. We must take care that in our concern for the victims of domestic violence, we do not redraw our doctrine of marriage," he said. Bishop Peter Lynn of the Georges River also spoke against the motion, saying he did not believe domestic abuse was automatically grounds for divorce and remarriage. "I'm a slow learner. This will take time," Bishop Lynn said of his consideration of the issues at hand. "I beg Synod to give those of us who are slow learners more time." We know that the extent of this test of orthodoxy is extensive. This idea of male headship has been the test of orthodoxy and the cause of church plants, women's conferences, movements, and the training grounds for young men. It doesn't take much more than a Google search of some of these places to discover that in their list of belief, they believe in male headship in the home and in the church. Today, I am very glad to have Kylie Maddox Pidgeon return, and alongside her, Nicky Locke. Ladies, welcome and thank you. Today is not the day we'll be looking at passages closely to determine what Ephesians 5:22 means in light of Ephesians 5:21, which translation to use, what does it mean that Adam was created first? We're going to say clearly from the start that we are affirming today a non-hierarchical view of relationships. We believe that the Spirit of God has distributed gifts for the sake of the church to all believers. We believe Paul affirms women in all levels of church leadership and, in fact, praises them for their gospel work. We, like them, are made in the image of God, and we have equal responsibility. We need the church to gather. We need to call the leaders into account. Women who have suffered at the hands of men cannot be expected to rally outside the cathedral and call for change. It's over to us. We need to do the hard work with the biblical text. We need to stop relying on those who have permission to lead a church to tell us what it says. We are educated. We have Bibles. We have the Spirit of God with us. We cannot have a sea of suits representing us to the world. We need to represent the light. A church that believes in the full personhood of women. A church that fights the injustices of the world like slavery, Aboriginal rights, environmental concerns, the dignity and rights of women to be safe and in turn their children. We do not need the church to represent misogyny. This past month, we have heard about the lessons taught by an ordained chaplain in a school where Year 10 boys were told to rate their potential girlfriends. For example, these girls would get 6 points if they were popular, loyalty, good looking, attractive, intelligent, strong Christian, kind and considerate, a virgin and trustworthy. What is going on in our church schools? Thank goodness, as soon as the headmaster heard about it, he put an end to it. But it suggested that there were complaints made to the previous principal about this years ago. And I suspect it's not the only school that's doing this. What are we allowing to be said in God's name? And what image of God are our young people being sold? What are young girls hearing? What about the young women who have been sexually assaulted? That they are less than because they're not a virgin according to that list of points? It's so not true. We want young men and women to hear that there is a God who loves them. There is a God who is with them, that they are wonderfully and fearfully made and have full agency in the world. They are equally valued and they have equal purpose. They are not subordinates due to their body parts. They have a part to play together to shine a light. We are losing women from our churches because our women, especially our young women, have been fed a lie, and it has to stop. And at this point, I'm going to invite Nicky into the conversation. Now, Nicky, you've got a long history here of working within the church, the wider church, both in Australia, in Sydney, overseas. You shared a great story with me earlier about some of the time that you spent in Pakistan, for example. You work for voluntarily for CBE Sydney, which is a fantastic organisation. You're a counsellor. You've been a member of the National Anglican Safe Ministry Commission, and you've worked on the Sydney Anglican DV Task Force. Nicky, you've got so much that I'm sure that we would appreciate hearing from you. Would you like to share some of your personal stories with us to start, please?
Yeah, surely. And I think I want to say I'm a woman of my time. So I grew up in UK in the sort of in my teens, in the late 60s, early 70s. My brother went to university with Jermaine Greer, and it was a fearfully exciting time for women. The message of men and women's equality was strong, and that was the era that I grew up in. And I left university believing the rhetoric, but also seeing that what was happening in the world was that men and women were being treated equally. There were still a few hiccups. I was asked at one of my first job interviews when I was married, when was I going to have a baby and should they employ me? Of course, we're no longer allowed to do that. But I really saw this sort of flourishing of women being able to fulfill their giftings. Unlike my mother, my mother had a first-class honours degree in German. She worked as a radio operator during World War II, translating secret radio messages. After World War II, she went and worked in the public service, and the day she got married, she had to leave. She never worked again. She was a woman of great intellect. She was a woman who did not fulfill her potential. And I wonder sometimes whether some of my drive to see women fulfilling their potential comes from seeing that waste in my mother. Along with that, I am a woman of post-war Britain. Post-war Britain was a depressed place. Post-war Britain was a place where thrift was high, after living through the war years. And I hate waste with a passion. I'm a rabid recycler. And what I see happens under complementarian theology is waste, a terrible waste of women and the way that God has gifted them. And so those two things together are part of sort of my driving passions behind, we have to do something about this. Yeah. Men and women, God has gifted men and women equally. We know that we are made in God's image. We are given equal stewardship. And we are wasting that under this regime that we live. Yeah, so that's my background. And I came to Sydney 35 years ago at a time when women's ordination was really taking off in the Anglican Church around the world. I was on synod in the 1990s, and I was heartbroken to see what happened around the issue of ordination for women in Sydney Diocese, where around the world things were opening up for women in the church. And not only was it shut down, not only were women shut down in the 1990s in Australia, but actually we have been shut down further in the last 30 years. And I have found that increasingly painful to see that it is not hopeful what is happening for women in the church in Sydney Diocese.
I think that's it, isn't it? It's worse. It's not getting better. We're becoming, and this is the sad thing, is that we're not called to be like the world, and yet the world is recognizing that women's voice is important. In education, children's voices have been recognized to be important, and yet women's voices are becoming more and more oppressed within the church. The disconnect is really stark, and that comes at a cost.
It is stark, and it does come at a cost. Just this idea that when we keep women out of leadership, when we keep women out of the pulpit, we are denying the world an expression of God. If we understand that God's revelation is, his full revelation is in the sort of full creation of the world, in men and women, in various ethnic groups around the world, that when we exclude 50% of the population from having a voice, we are actually shutting down on that revelation.
Yeah. Would you mind sharing that story that you just shared with me earlier about your time in Pakistan and that parallel with Jesus and the woman at the well? Because whenever I hear about Jesus and anything in the Bible, really, I'm just like, my heart just, I love Jesus. It's I love it. Do you mind sharing that story with us?
So a few years ago, I went with a mission organisation to teach trauma counselling in a theological college in Pakistan. And the organisation that I was going with said, oh, you'll probably find it easier to take your husband with you. And I thought, oh, well, okay. Having been used to, my husband was in the corporate world, and I was often the handbag at the corporate business dinner. But in this case, he came to Pakistan to be my handbag while I was the one working and teaching. And I'm so glad I took him, because life in Pakistan for women is incredibly restricted. Women are not allowed to do anything by themselves without either a female chaperone or a male chaperone, and the male chaperone must either be your husband or a man that you are related to. So there were things that would have been impossible for me to do if my husband had not been with me. And it was living in that culture for 4 weeks, where a man whom I was not related to was not allowed to talk to me, that I realized how radical that story is of Jesus being at the well with the Samaritan woman, that there she was on her own, no chaperone, and Jesus as a man had this incredibly deep sort of theological conversation with her. That was a very radical thing to do.
He saw her. It's a little bit of, I'm just having a technical problem here. I'm not sure whether there's a little bit of echoes. Is there echoing going on?
It's fine on my end.
Okay, good. It might just be my end. I just love the way that Jesus treated women. And I think that we forget, don't we? Like, you know, my Bible here wasn't published last year. There's the stories in there, the way that it was so different. We're never going to fully understand what it's like for them. We're in the technology world where we can text people and we can download stuff off the internet, and we can be in workplaces where we are respected as women. We can work where we have money of our own, for women who are privileged enough to be in that position. Whereas for these women, their lives were so different. They were ostracized. Women who were bleeding were ostracized, seemed to be unclean. Like, it's just so radical what Jesus did, how he entered the world and showed us how to live, is just so beautiful. Anyway, thank you. I digress. I could talk about Jesus all afternoon. So I also want to just say that I am watching. The reason there's technical difficulties is because I do have our live stream going there on the side. And I am going to be watching for questions. And I know both of you have been happy for me to direct questions to you if they come through. Nicky, you've been deeply involved, and I want to thank you for the work that you've done with women and with men, addressing domestic violence particularly. And we know it's not just an issue for Sydney. We know that this is a problem worldwide, but we know that there's conditions in Sydney that have been particular over the past little while that have had a light shone on it. Are you happy to discuss a little bit of what you've seen, given that in the Sydney context, a lot of the issues have been, the stories and the testimonies of women have been saying that the issue of it being part of the hierarchical complementarian position. What have you seen as a result of that? What's been coming out of your insights there?
Well, as it's Julia Baird spoke to me when she did her work 5 years ago. I've worked as a counsellor. I worked as a counsellor for Anglicare for a number of years, and saw a lot of victims of domestic violence, mainly women, a handful of men, and for those who were either in some kind of conservative church, the issue of misuse of theology or misuse of scripture was common, and it had a bad impact in two ways. It both gave the abusive male perpetrator a weapon to use against his wife in many ways. I mean, not to demand regular sex, to tell her that he was in charge, he was in control, to denigrate her in various ways. I mean, you would find it hard to believe how scripture can be used to denigrate women. But the other more insidious aspect of this doctrine of headship, where we on the task force, we did a survey amongst clergy to see how they teach headship, and they used words like sacrificial leadership for the man, and for the woman to willingly submit to this sacrificial leadership. Now, of course, what's in there is the word leadership, which means that the man is seen as being in control. So it's this issue of being in control that would then be misused by the male perpetrator. But not only was it this impact of what the male perpetrator did, but it is then the female feels she has to submit to this abuse because she believes that is her role, to submit. So it has a sort of double whammy in terms of holding the woman in a position where she continues to be abused. And often many of the women I saw had been abused for years, like 10 years or 15 years or 20 years of horrible abuse under this, and the woman believing, well, I have to do this. this is what I have to do.
Yeah.
I've worked with a number of, Nicky's certainly had a longer career than me so far, but you have these problems that come about from exactly what Nicky's talking about. Men are empowered to be in a leadership role, which actually just means in charge. Leadership's nowhere in the Bible when it comes to husbands and wives. And it's done, I think there's elements of coercive control around that. So when willing submission is presented to women as the most godly option, or the only godly option sometimes, the thing that's unsaid then is that to not submit is not of God and is not a spiritual act. I mean, there's been a number of prominent people in recent years that have said the submission of women is voluntary. I don't think so, because in the sense that if it was voluntary, there'd be an equally viable alternative. There'd be another option that you could take without adverse consequences, without feeling less spiritual, without feeling like you're not as godly. But that option isn't available to women within this kind of submission discourse. So first of all, you get that, where there's this kind of subtle, insidious, coercive control thing happening to tell women to submit. But then if that's ever questioned, you get the same dynamic happening again, where if women say, this submission thing isn't working for me, I'm being treated badly, or he's doing this to me, or this is happening, or I'm being forced to whatever, she can only go to people with equal privilege to the perpetrator. So the governance structures around it, the people that you can go to say that this is a problem and this is happening are in the same boat. There's nobody independent. There's nobody who's kind of not. I was in the Presbyterian system a number of years ago, similar to Anglicanism in some ways, and the people that you would go to complain about something like this were the perpetrator's mates.
Yeah.
So the system just mirrors exactly what Nicky's talking about. It can happen within a relationship, but it happens within a church as well. So I think, Nicky, we're talking about oppression of women kind of generally, aren't we? And we're giving different examples of where it can kind of show up.
I brought this up actually recently on a forum that I was part of, that I was invited to be part of. I actually really feel sorry for a lot of our ministers when it comes to having to care for women in this world, because I don't believe that they have the training. I think it's really difficult for women to approach them. I think that's the bigger issue here. But I don't believe that we have systems in place in our churches to make it safe for women to come forward, because often the case is that the husband is someone in leadership and has put on the face, a mask every Sunday in a Bible study, and no one would possibly believe that that person is actually capable of the things that the wife is testifying to.
Yep.
And that is concerning. I would really like to see some changes in what's going on at the coalface in churches to provide very safe places for women to be able to come forward and talk to someone about it.
Absolutely.
So Nicky, you were going to say something?
Well, I think Kylie mentioned this word oppression of women. The difficulty about the system that we have is that when you're in a church that subscribes to a complementarian theology, is that power is retained by men. So we don't have women in leadership, and the woman's voice is suppressed. So there is no public woman's voice. So there's no public, there's no woman's voice preaching, or very limited number of women are preaching. And in my system, in the Anglican system in Sydney, even if a woman is preaching, she's only preaching with permission of the minister of her congregation. So she may be licensed by the Archbishop to preach, but she is still, it is only with the permission of her minister that she is allowed to preach. So men retain all the power. So inherently, the system we have, there is a power imbalance and women are disempowered. And this is part of this dynamic as to why it's hard for women to go to the male minister for help, because she knows, I mean, either consciously or unconsciously, that the whole system sets up that the male leaders have the power. We don't have female leaders with power. Female leaders do not share power in our system. So inherently the woman is, I mean, all women in this kind of system are disempowered by the system.
And so often when we talk about spiritual gifts, we also need to recognize that in the system that we have, often the pastor, the male pastor, their spiritual gifting might not be the gifting of loving and providing pastoral care. And so the system's really letting men down as well. That's not the biggest issue here, but I really do believe that whole process is so wrong right now, and it needs.
Well, we know from the recent National Anglican Survey that it's only a small percentage of domestic violence victims who actually go to their church for help. So I think, you know, the proof, you know, that statistic shows us that women don't trust churches as places to go for help. So even, I mean, I want to say that we have done a lot of work in the church in this area in the last 5 years. You know, the domestic violence policy that we developed in Sydney, despite all, you know, shortcomings, is a pretty reasonable policy. There is training now. There's a lot more conversation around the issue of domestic violence. And some of that came out in the Anglican survey, that clergy are much more aware of the issue. They are receiving some training. There is training available online, but still women are not going to the church for support. So despite that better conversation, they are still not going to the church for support.
And can we make sure that I mean, I fully support those women who don't go to their church for support.
Yes.
We've heard, let's not say that that's the women's fault for not going to the church.
Yeah, no.
To the church, because they should not have. The amount of stories that sometimes I work with a client, I don't know, my longest is probably about 3 years, working with a client to support her through the damage that was done by her going to her church.
Wow.
We work through the DV stuff, but then there's this whole process of re-victimization and not being believed, and the dynamics being replicated by the church that were happening with her perpetrator. She was undermined, disbelieved, second-guessed, questioned in all the wrong ways.
Well, you know, what's Jesus in that, right? That's exactly the opposite of what Jesus does. Sorry, Kylie, I'm just like going to speak over you there. That's so appalling.
It's the opposite of what needs to be happening.
Yes.
So, yes, exactly.
Yes, so people might not necessarily have had the training that they need, but that's no excuse for not listening to women and not helping them, right? Because all of us are human beings. All of us know that we need to be light and we need to love others. We might not do it the best all the time, but, you know, that's basic human behavior.
Every church, every Christian can listen and believe.
Yeah.
If that's all you do, that is brilliant. Listen and believe, and then say, I'm not trained in this, but let's, you know, I'd love to help you find someone that is.
Yeah.
If that's all you can do, that's amazing. Please do that. But I support the victims and survivors who don't go to their church for help, because churches, generally, there are some churches who are good at it, but generally churches are not skilled and equipped enough to manage this well. Oppression of women, and in DV in particular, that's kind of my angle that I work the most with. So it's like DV work is specialist work. So another example is what medical specialty. You wouldn't go to your minister because you've got appendicitis, right? Yeah. They're not skilled, they're not equipped. They might say, okay, I'll drive you to the hospital. That might be their role, or something like that. But for them to go, right, you've got appendicitis, okay, I'll try and sort that out for you. That's so absolutely important. Outside of their skill set, ethically questionable, morally questionable. So yeah, churches are not at a point where they can intervene into DV particularly well. Having said that, there has been some progress. So I think maybe 5 or 10 years ago, churches were at a point of unconscious incompetence. That is, they didn't know how bad they were. They were not aware that they were unskilled, and so they might attempt to intervene. I think we've seen progress because churches are moving towards, or some are at a point of conscious incompetence. That is, they are aware that they are not skilled enough to intervene in a helpful way. That's a good step. We would love churches to move to a place of competence. That's where we're going. Hopefully we'll get there. But at the moment, it's helpful that churches recognise that they're not skilled and equipped enough to intervene effectively in DV. Partly because in comp churches, the same dynamics are at work that oppress women at home. They're operating at church as well. And so to have to untangle all those biases and all those cultural implications and all those ways that you would think that men are more credible and men are more believable, and he would never do that because I've never seen him do that. And really, did he actually do what you said he'd do? What he did?
I think part of this, Kylie, is because we don't have women in leadership.
Of course.
I mean, what we've seen in the business world and in government, public service, is the more we have women in leadership, the more women are part of the conversation, and they're able to alert men to some of these more subtle things like unconscious bias.
Not even alert men, just take the lead on dealing with the issue.
Well, but it's about raising awareness, because, my dear husband, he's very supportive of me. We live, what we would call an egalitarian marriage. But sometimes I've had conversations with him and I say, how many times do you talk about sexual harassment at work? And he would go, well, never. It's not an issue. And I'm kind of going, well, for most women, sexual harassment is an issue. And if you have more women in leadership, then you will have more women raising awareness and having the conversation about these things. So this is part of the issue, because we only have men in leadership. We don't have women there to talk about these issues.
Yeah. And we know from all the social science research that diverse teams perform better. It's a little bit clunkier in the room because you've got to try and understand different people's perspectives and come to a consensus sometimes. But in the long term, and to represent the people that you're leading, diverse teams perform better on every measure. And it kind of baffles me that churches don't take up that truth, that to hear from a bunch of voices and to have people that represent all sorts of different groups in leadership, you get better outcomes, not just because it's nicer, but because it works better. So that's a really obvious example, Nicky. To have women in leadership, a more diverse team will perform better on all sorts of measures and when it comes to all sorts of different topics.
Yeah. One of the things that was brought to our attention this week was that there's actually a quota, because we're talking about the Sydney Anglican world, because that's what was brought up the other night by Jeff Broughton. There's a quota that's actually in men's favour in Sydney, and there are some who are calling for that to be readdressed and looked at. But it needs to be 50-50. And we need to have
when it comes to what? A quota in what arena?
So women in the Synod,
yeah.
or on various, when you look at the councils, the parish councils, for example, very rarely will you see more faces of women than men. Very rarely will you even see 50-50. Very rarely will you even see 25%. That needs to change.
Yeah.
It's a very, very simple thing to do. There will be women in the pews who are able to use their skills, their insights, their wisdom on those councils for the better of the church.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Okay. So let's have a look at oh gosh.
Can we talk about those results from the Anglican survey that was just released?
Yeah, please do, Kylie, because I know that you've had some questions around that directed to you.
Yeah, that have come in the last few days.
So that would be great.
We've still only got the top line results, I think, Nicky. Is that right? I haven't seen
we've just got the top line, yeah.
Which means a summary of the findings. So the key findings of this research, this is the National Anglican Family Violence Project, which was conducted over a number of years by partners, including the National Church Life Survey. And the key findings of that research is that there is a significant interpersonal partner violence problem within the Anglican Church of Australia. Let that sink in.
Mm.
Significant problem. The prevalence of intimate partner violence among Anglicans was the same or higher than in the wider Australian community. The prevalence of intimate partner violence among church attending Anglicans was the same or higher. The prevalence of intimate partner violence was higher among women than men as victims and survivors. And as we've already talked about, most Anglican victims of DV did not seek help from their church. I mean, I'm shocked but not surprised. We've known these stories. They've come through Baird and Gleason's research. They've come through from psychologists and counsellors and DV workers for many years. We know that this is happening on the ground, but this is the first bigger scale piece of research that has confirmed what we've known for a long time. So, I mean, that's extraordinary that the rates are higher than in the general population. The survey design, I mean, I haven't heard much criticism of the survey design or the way that this was gone about, so let's not talk about if there was bias or whatever in the research. I think that the data is what it is. There's got to be some particular risk factors then. There has to be for rates to be higher in the church than in the general population. What the heck is going on? There's protective factors as well in the church, and we know that, where people are seeking to love and care for one another, where people are seeking to live peaceful lives and model graciousness and kindness and respect. There are protective factors happening which you'd hope would reduce the rate of violence, and yet it's still higher than the general population. So there has got to be one or more drivers of what's causing this. And of course I'm going to get shot down by saying that headship is the most obvious likely factor, but that's really clear from the evidence.
That's right.
The primary driver of domestic violence is gender inequality. The complementarian church is by definition a place where the genders are not given equal voice, opportunity, and participation. So I mean, I can't speak very clearly around correlation and causation because we don't have the data. We can't.
I want to push back a little bit.
Go.
In that, this was a national survey, and Anglicanism nationally does not subscribe to complementarianism, so we do need to be careful.
Doesn't that make it even more remarkable, though, that there is more egalitarian churches being surveyed within this, and yet still?
So we don't know what the difference is between comp and egal type congregations and things, but I think the really important thing for us to look at is to say we have, as you pointed out, the same or higher than the general population, and we would hope that it would be, given we're supposed to love each other, that it should be less. And so it is really quite shocking that the prevalence is seen as the same or higher. And I think that's what we've really got to wait and see when the more granular results come out later on the year as to how much, this, is it sort of the general hierarchy of what goes on in the church? Is it complementarianism? These are really difficult things to work out. Is it, what is it in the church that is holding DV at the same level as in the community? And maybe different things in different places. Of course, the other issue and this was the issue that you quoted, Jennifer, at the beginning, was the issue of the sanctity of marriage. This is another contributory factor where women feel unable to speak out because of the teaching around the sanctity of marriage. But there is something we have to look at here.
Absolutely.
What is going on that we have this high prevalence?
That's right. So previous research, this not the Anglican study, but I'm referring to the body of research that existed previously. There have been multiple parallel dynamics identified that exist both in a church of male headship and in a domestic and family violence dynamic. So they are these things. These have been identified to be related. Men exercising unilateral power over women, and that power over women being done kindly or in loving service doesn't mitigate the risk. Women being restricted in decision-making and public engagement. Cultures of victim blaming rather than taking responsibility by the people in power. Emphasis on forgiveness rather than accountability. Stigma and shame surrounding divorce. Rigid gender roles, and the absence of effective accountability for men.
Wow. We can just tick all those off, really, can't we?
The parallel dynamics are quite striking.
Yeah.
Research also shows, and these are different studies, again, the recent Anglican one has not talked about these things, but previously, research shows that positive associations have been found between traditional gender role beliefs, traditional men-women roles, and beliefs that function to rationalise, justify, and perpetuate men's violence against women. There's a correlation between those things. So we can't say that it causes it, it's just a correlation, but those things are related. If one rises, so does the other. There's other parallels too, like on the Duluth Power and Control Wheel, which is one of the kind of go-to summaries of the types of forms and shapes that DV can take. There's some on there that, again, just bear striking resemblance to what's happening in churches. One is the perpetrator making all the big decisions for the arena, which is kind of what comp churches do. And the perpetrator being the one to define men's and women's roles. So the person in charge defines what their role is and what the other person's role is. They're both kind of core tenets of churches of male headship. And there's another one that I've kind of just realised too, on the power and control wheel, one of the examples of control can be preventing her from accessing employment or restricting her employment opportunities. Yeah. And again, that's mirrored really closely, where more men are hired and more men are hired for the senior roles, and women are not allowed to take senior ministry roles in a lot of places. So there's so much more research that needs to be done into how those parallels and how those similarities interact and what the impact of them is in churches.
Yeah, I think you're right, Kylie. I think, you know, there is enough research around I mean, there are a lot of drivers for DV, IPV, the word we want to use. Gender inequality is has, as you mentioned the other night, clearly been shown as a contributor in the establishment of DV. And clearly, you know, the more complementarian the theology of a church, maybe the more conservative a church is, with those rigid gender roles, those are they are likely to be risk factors. I mean, why would they not be risk factors? They're seen as risk factors in the general population. The UN stats, where they're looking at DV worldwide, gender inequality, you know, access to equal opportunities in terms of employment, power, voice. These are the things that we don't have in churches where they have a very conservative theology around the roles of men and women.
Yep.
Yeah. In 2015, it was written in the ABC by someone who's currently in the UK, who grew up in Sydney attending Anglican churches. She wrote, Sydney Anglicans must honestly and urgently revisit the legitimacy of male headship as a biblical concept, rather than explain away the incidences as an inconvertible teaching wrongly applied, incontrollable. While male headship may not necessarily trip the switch of abuse, it can provide the wiring. We're not trying to say here that every complementarian marriage is going to be one where there is domestic and family violence going on, but certainly there's triggers there that if we listen to women, that we're hearing their stories that are used.
I think we need, that's right, we need to, what you've just described there is risk and danger, where risk is where all the factors that may contribute are present. You're stepping towards the cliff, if you like, and then danger is when you're being pushed or, you know, just facing the edge of the cliff, the body of research is very clear on what the risk factors are. And the complementarian church has a bunch of them, some of them by definition. I think it's helpful too to think about primary prevention, secondary intervention, and tertiary postvention when it comes to gender equality, oppression of women, and domestic violence. So primary prevention in any kind of case is kind of a population-wide, how do we mitigate this problem before it happens to help the majority? Putting fluoride in the water is like an obvious example of that. Put fluoride in the water, everybody's teeth are better off, helps prevent the problems down the track. When it comes to oppression of women, gender equality is that most obvious primary prevention factor. If we have gender inequality, then a lot of the other problems fall away. Secondary intervention in this context would refer to specific cultures, specific contexts, specific places. So that could be the church, that could be Sydney Anglicanism, that could be whatever. You kind of think of your context. What are the specific risk factors for this place? It could be theology. It could be culture. It could be, does that geographical area have any particular risks or whatever it might be? I'm not sure the church has done either of those first two very well. We're starting and we're learning, but I don't think the church has articulated that we need to be champions of gender equality generally, and I don't know that it's been particularly good at understanding what its risk factors are. Again, there's social science research out there. Look at Priest, Biddle and Truong from Australian National University. They're really good at looking at those secondary intervention factors. What are the risk factors for faith communities when it comes to oppression of women? Look up their research. And then there's the tertiary postvention. What do we do after DV has happened, or what do we do after oppression of women has happened? My understanding of this whole conversation that we've had about DV and women in the church over the last few years is that the church is either ignoring or driving the primary and secondary factors, driving gender inequality. The secondary stuff, I'm not so. No, I think we're complementarian churches drive some of the factors that have been shown to be problematic for women.
Yeah.
But then they try and condemn the abuse that happens in the third case. We drive this and we drive this, and then, oh, look, abuse happens. Oh, no, we've got to try and support survivors and, create funds to help ministry wives who have suffered abuse. Good. We've got to intervene at every place. But, I think that's particularly untenable to be driving gender inequality and to not be mitigating the risk factors that happen in your particular context, and then condemning the resultant abuse.
Yeah. And when we're saying that divorce from public forums in churches on the platform, when not all Sydney Anglicans will say this, but there are some in significant positions of power, that divorce is wrong, that's just another factor, right? That's just going to cause an awful lot of problems. And we've got people commenting here on YouTube that fears around divorce is one of the most suppressive factors stopping women from speaking up. Divorce fears include shame, financial impacts on children, etc., in a non-supportive church culture. That's when divorce has even happened for lots of women. They don't go down that path because they're told that it is wrong and that God is against it, that they are to, as we've heard, some significant Bible teachers, is why I hate Piper being quoted from the platform, because Piper has said some appalling things in this field. And if we just stop, as a result of today, if we just stop quoting from some of these men who have said things, doesn't matter that they might say a zillion other great things, but if they've said this, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter what else they say. That's what
I think one of the things that kind of bothers me about this whole debate is the issue of pain, and the like in some, I mean, here we are back on the DV track again. And of course, it's an enormously important topic and we should be talking about it. But Julia made the point the other night. She said, when are we going to listen to women and women's pain? Now, Jeff Broughton, who is a colleague of mine, whom I highly respect, and he said, this is what he said the other night, I think that the weight of that pain and those tears, that's pretty compelling that we've not got things right. And he says, I wish more of my colleagues could hear that pain. I'm just not sure, what do we have to do? I mean, I could sit here and tell some stories about my personal pain, the day my bishop called me a burr under the saddle, the day when I spoke out about gender equality in DV at a public teaching forum, and I've not been asked to teach since. When are people going to, when are men, the men in power who make decisions, when are they going to hear this pain, and will it make a difference? Because it seems to me we have spoken about women's pain in terms of DV victims, Ducky Service talking about, her not being allowed to preach even though she has a PhD and is lecturing in systematic theology, and her pain at that. I'm not sure how do we get this pain to be heard? This is what I see as a big problem, in that I see my brothers and sisters who disagree with me over this theological position. Is them hearing the pain going to make a difference or not? I mean, for me, I guess I'm a practitioner. I'm not a theologian. I have a certain amount of theological study, but I'm not a theologian. And I look at what I see in front of me and I think about this definition of practical theology: a critical theological reflection on the practices of the church as they interact with the practices of the world, with a view to ensuring and enabling faithful participation in God's redemptive practices in, to, and for the world. That's by John Swinton, practical theologian. And it kind of resonates with what Jeff Broughton was saying the other night, that practically we have to look at, what are we doing here? Is what we are doing working? And is part of the challenge of looking at what we are doing working is ensuring that this pain is heard and listened and honoured, and that something is done in response to this pain. Because we've done something, as Kylie's saying, we are saying we're going to respond to abuse, we're going to do training, we're going to find money for clergy wives. But is that, I guess that is the question, is that enough? Have we done enough in response to the pain of women?
Very good question.
Nope. The $50,000 that was made available to clergy wives, I don't think that even covers legal fees, let alone everything else. The cost is far greater than that.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of other pains as well that women experience in this space.
I think that's such a good question, Nicky. How can this be heard? And I remember the other night Julia's frustration at, she's been telling these stories for a long time. There's not an absence of stories. The information is there. I think that's a very good question. What will it take? And who's responsible?
And my guess is the stories. There's Jackie referred to there being 1,000 stories, and there are 1,000 small stories. One of my small stories is going to a cathedral where there was a woman presiding over communion and preaching, and finding myself sobbing in the pews, because for the first time in my life, I had been ministered to by somebody of my own gender. That is a pain that women bear all the time, because we are not ministered to by people of our own gender. That pain is ignored. It's never addressed, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who's had that experience.
Of course not. Yeah. and the cost of the pain.
Hmm.
I feel the same pain. I feel the same vigilance. Am I safe here? Can I be myself here? If I say I'm a gifted teacher, leader, preacher, will that be received or will I be shunned? I carry that. I'm interested in the cost of that. If we're there being vigilant and worried and in pain, what are we not doing?
Mm.
We're busy tending to holding ourselves together and breathing deeply and just make it through and I'll be okay, and who can I talk to, rather than being free to worship or free to minister or free to care for the person next to us.
Yeah, so you're right, there is a cost. There is a cost to this.
And there's a cost to our communities then, isn't there? That we're not released into our giftings to be able to serve our community in the way that we should be.
Yeah.
To be that light.
Mm. Mm.
I'm looking at some of the comments as we're speaking here, and there's two things I would love to say. Stigma around divorce and stigma around the role of women are two of the drivers for women staying in problematic and abusive situations. We know that. I want to say to people who are suffering abuse or people who are treated badly, it's not your fault. And divorce is not brought about by someone filing for divorce in these cases. Abuse is the thing that ends the marriage.
Such an important point. Thank you, Kylie.
A marriage under God is a place of health and mutuality. If you are still living with someone who treats you badly, I would argue that the covenant has already been broken, that the marriage has already been killed. So many women feel that in their spirit, but don't feel like they're allowed to say it. But I think that's true. God is divorced, by the way. The Bible talks about God giving Israel a certificate of divorce and sending her away for her unfaithfulness. So please don't feel like divorce is not understandable by God. God is divorced. God knows what it is to not be able to be in covenant with someone because the covenant is broken. We really need a shift in discourse about that. Abuse ends marriages.
Julie Nixon wrote a piece for us talking about the children as well. And I think they're so often not considered with all of this conversation. And we need to bring them to the forefront alongside the women and say, for the children's sake.
Yep.
For the children's sake. Of course, God is going to be okay with divorce.
There's a greater degree of vulnerability, isn't there? There's one degree of vulnerability being female. There's extra degrees when you're a child who can't understand what's happening or can't advocate for yourself or doesn't have those resources around you to seek refuge and safety. We have even greater responsibility to the more vulnerable people to offer protection and care. So, yeah.
And they know that it's not okay. And that's really important too, that they know that the behaviour of their father, for this instance, is not okay.
This is my dog Lulu. She's come to weigh in on the conversation.
Thank you, Lulu.
The other thing I want to say to survivors is I'm sorry. I'm sorry that the church hasn't been a place of refuge for some of you. I'm sorry that the church hasn't been a leader in protecting you and meeting your needs. I'm sorry that you haven't been seen in every sense of the word. We're talking about some of this in theory, but obviously we all know personal stories and that it's very real on the ground too. So yeah, I just need to honour survivors like you did at the beginning of this session, Jen.
Thank you, Kylie. And Nicky, there's a personal cost in speaking out. So I thank both of you for doing that today, because I know that's it's not always easy to put yourself out there. So often I've been told how important it is that we work together with the other, and we want unity and not division in the church. Nicky, do you want to speak to that for a moment for me? And maybe Kylie, you might like to add something.
Well, I think it's we have to keep in dialogue with people. This change is not made by fighting wars. Change is made by dialogue, honest dialogue, and I guess that's what my hope would be around this issue, that we can continue to have open and honest dialogue. And I want to put on myself, when I think about that, something that Rowan Williams talks about dialogue. He says, if to genuinely enter into dialogue with someone, you must be willing to be changed by their perspective. So I want to say to myself, to enter into this dialogue, that I must be willing to be open to hearing and listening to what the other is saying, as I hope they will be open to listening and hearing what I'm saying, because that's not my, I mean, what happened around the women's ordination movement in Sydney Diocese, we had a vote in 2006 to say that we're not going to talk about this anymore, and we haven't talked about it for 15 years. So there is no dialogue over these issues. I would like there to be an open dialogue.
Yeah. And certainly you're representing not just yourself, but there's a lot of people in the Sydney Anglican Church who feel the same way. And so hopefully if that's one step in the right direction, if that can happen. Kylie, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about that whole, the push that we have to work together and not cause division over this?
I mean, in one sense, I think that's like, I think we are talking about oppression. I think we are.
I can feel their sighs. It's a hard one.
Yes, it's got to be a conversation, but I'm not sure it has to just be a conversation. I mean, the kind of conversation I would love for the people who make decisions about how women are treated in the church to come and sit in my counselling room for a day. I would love that. That's not possible for a number of reasons. It's never going to happen. I mean, I want them to sit with the women who have to come to me or to Nicky or to whoever to deal with how they've been treated at church.
Yeah. And I have to say again, this is not a problem that is wholly and solely the Sydney Anglicans. I got a message yesterday from someone from a Pentecostal church to say that to keep on going. She was pleading with us to keep on talking about this because it's an issue in her denomination as well. And I'd be naive to think that it wasn't. And one of the concerns there was that when they start talking about these matters is that husbands take their wives and their families and go to another church because their women become too informed and too educated. And that's just devastating. We want people to be thinking about this. We actually want to have some rigorous conversations and study. And I talked about earlier about this is no new thing. This is a dark moment in history that we are living through right now, and people have been oppressed. Men have been told to keep quiet. I would suggest that even Kevin Giles, who's written all the books that we linked to on Fixing Our Eyes yesterday, has got his own story behind this, alongside a lot of other men. That we need to have an acknowledgement, first and foremost, that people who hold to a non-hierarchical view can actually, first of all, be acknowledged that we're actually Bible-believing Christians, right? Like, that's one of the, I think the language that is used in this debate, for want of a better word, is horrific. The idea that this is a mark of orthodoxy, the fact that we're not Bible believing Christians, if we don't think it, if we hold some other view, that we're kind of seen to be these strange, whacked out Christians, right? Like left leaning, all the rest of it. And I proudly stand in that space. That I'll totally own that. But this is what we're dealing with here, is that we are the minority in our worlds, and we're championing for full equality, both in the home and in church. This is not some sort of weird interpretation. There are scholars, and we can start enlisting them, and ones that I know that are held in high regard in evangelical circles that are being completely dismissed here. And that's highly concerning, that the view that's being given to us is so narrow, that I don't believe is what the Bible gives us.
Yeah.
I guess really I would like to encourage everybody who's watching tonight and been watching the conversations during the week, is we need to have the conversations. We need to not be quiet about it. Jeff Broughton was with us. He was talking out clearly and fearlessly, and I would like to see every other man and woman who is on, has a view about this, to be speaking about it. And I did find a Tutu quote after Jeff was talking the other night about being neutral and not speaking out. And this is what he says. And I think it's a rather lovely image. If you are neutral or silent in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality.
What a great quote. That's exactly, that's the problem we're facing right now.
We need to have the conversations, all of us. Go and talk to your minister. Go and talk to your bishop. We need the conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And there are people who have been doing a lot of work in this area in the last few years, and I'm really thankful to all the men who have been involved with Fixing Our Eyes over many years and given us their support in the background and said, we need this platform. You need this platform. Women need your platform. Who have written for us, who have spoken at our conferences, that the journal that Jeff Broughton was a part of, which collection of articles by men and women in their who are experts in their field. So important.
I have an article in there.
Yes, you do.
I do.
Yes, you do. And this is it, right? We need to be listening to the experts. We need them around the table.
And it is an issue of expertise, and those schools exist. So counsellors that work with people who have had problems in the church, they come to us and they tell us all about it. Like, we're a wealth of knowledge on what it looks like. The School of Behavioural Economics is another one that has loads of evidence behind it about the biases that are created by treating people differently. And social epidemiology is the other school of research around this. Social epidemiology looks at the impact of prejudice or bias or different treatment on people on their health. And there are huge health impacts. If you don't give people equal opportunity in voice participation, there's health impacts. They come out less healthy than people who are more privileged. So I think to be loving the women in our churches, leaders need to understand that this is not a neutral issue. If you deny women full voice and participation in the church, there are health impacts for them. I don't think the theological debate will cut it anymore. I can see why people land with a male headship view of the Bible. I can see why people get there. There's some passages that mean that you can get there. I understand that. I also see that you can get to a mutual, equal, respectful partners' understanding of the Bible, competent egalitarian, if you want to put it that way. My question to the church is, given that there are two views that I can see that you would land at, and all the complexities of getting there, but to oversimplify, two views that you could land on, why would you pick the oppressive one?
Yes.
Why would you do that? There are worse outcomes for the people who are not men in power. And I think to claim that we are loving one another and yet perpetuating a system of power and privilege that necessarily disadvantages the people who are not in power and privileged, that is worse for them. And that there's evidence to say that. There's loads of evidence in the social science research that says people who are not in positions of power and privilege have worse outcomes on all sorts of measures. I don't know of any research that says the opposite, that says that male headship is good for women and children. I just don't know it. Please tell me if there is some. I've had some people flick me some in the last couple of days. Does this say it? And I read it. Nope. Doesn't say it. Try again. So if there's any, please let me know. And I think it is a question of truth, not biblical truth, because we can have the theological debate till the cows come home, but all the social science evidence says to treat people with mutual equality and respect, regardless of gender, is better. So that's my question to the church. Why would you choose the gendered theology that has worse outcomes for people?
So that's that subliminal message that we're giving to young boys and young girls by not having women on that platform.
Yep.
Speaking from the Bible that they can read, that they would have been trained in understanding and sharing. That's deeply concerning.
It promotes unconscious bias. So when you see a lack of equality, you internalize that bias that says, so for example, in a church where men only minister and preach and women don't, you will internalize a bias that says men are superior at preaching and ministry. Even if you say that they are not and that everyone's equal and it's not a question of capability, the saying that doesn't overcome the seeing it. Is it Matthew 28, the parable of the two sons? The kingdom of God is revealed in what is done rather than what is said. Same principle. So again, there's social science evidence to back that up. What is seen sinks in more than what is said. So to say we're equal, but to demonstrate that women are prevented from participating in all these spheres, that's the important bit.
Yeah, and that's not how I get to the position that I hold of a non-hierarchical position for church and marriage. But these are the flow-on effects that I believe we're going to be seeing. Is the message that we are giving the next generation of believers, unless we see some radical change.
Yep.
And that's beyond concerning. Is there anything else, Kylie, that you've been asked during the week that you wanted to speak to? Because I know you've been given a lot of questions.
Yes, but while I look up the questions I've been sent, Nicky, there's one here that is absolutely for you.
Right.
It's about supervision. This is from Sarah. Nicky, I'm keen to understand the mandate for professional supervision for pastors and the uptake of this. This is a question made for you. Where's supervision at for ministers? So
simply put, the mandate came from the Royal Commission Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, the final report, the recommendations. I think there are two, I think it's 16.5 or something, 16.45, don't quote me necessarily on the numbers, but that all clergy and church workers should have professional supervision with a trained supervisor who has a degree of independence from the institution. So that's where it started. In the Anglican Church on the Safe Ministry Commission, we've just developed a policy document around supervision, professional development and ministry reviews that will be going to General Synod later this year. Hopefully will be adopted by General Synod and then will be circulated to dioceses. It's a document that talks about how much supervision in a year, what is a trained supervisor, how are you going to develop a register of supervisors, and give some useful resources. So it's actually a resourcing document as well for the diocese to help implement a regular program of professional supervision for clergy and church workers across the Anglican Church.
And how, for someone who's considering supervision for the first time, what kind of things can supervision help ministry workers with?
Well, first of all, our document is actually called Wellbeing in Ministry, because first and foremost, professional pastoral supervision is about well-being.
Yep.
Inskip and Proctor have this lovely view of what they call the functional model of supervision. It's a three-legged stool, has the supportive aspects of professional supervision, sort of educative aspects where people learn things, and then the thing that obviously the Royal Commission were looking for, the normative or boundary setting ethical practice. So the space within the professional supervision to be supported, to learn, and also for the supervisor just to be keeping an eye on, how are you going? You know, maybe you're so tired and burnt out that actually you probably need a break because you're probably not ministering very well. But equally, if there was some whiff of unethical practice, to actually call the person on their practice.
As helping professions, Nicky and I, we have to have supervision. I have to have 10 hours a year. I actually use about 20, 25 because it's so helpful. I wish that was across the board for ministry. It'd be so helpful, wouldn't it, Nicky, to have someone who you can ask questions of?
It's really coming on. The Anglican Church is taking it pretty seriously. A lot of the major dioceses are implementing schemes already. The Catholic Church has implemented a mandatory system already for all their priests. The Uniting Church is working on their system. The Baptists are working on their systems as well. So I think in 2 or 3 years, we will have a pretty comprehensive system of providing professional pastoral supervision for clergy and church workers.
And it's not remedial. It's not because you're in trouble. It's more, it's coaching and mentoring and skill development.
Coaching, development, yeah.
That's so good. That's what we all need. And Angela, who was on the panel the other night, said in my diocese, we've already adopted mandatory supervision. I meet with a qualified psychologist a minimum of 10 times a year. And both she and I report on this to the diocese. Gosh, there's been some good work in the church, hasn't there? Like we can't lose sight of the fact that there has been progress in lots of areas. And this is one of them. And I think that needs to be acknowledged.
Yeah.
It's really important.
Yep.
Now, was there anything else, Kylie, that came across your way? Or from Nicky?
I think we've covered it. So the questions that came into me were around the topics of, is there really no evidence that headship is helpful? So I've addressed that. If you know of any, please send it in. Why has the recent family violence research shown equal or greater rates of intimate partner violence? And we've talked about that a little bit. And does headship really contribute to DV? So they're the arenas that I've had questions around. I think we've talked about that.
Yeah. How about you, Nicky? Was there anything else you'd like to add to the conversation?
I think we've had a pretty comprehensive conversation.
Yes, we have.
I think it might be talked out, and maybe people are listening to the three of us.
It's almost time for dinner.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you, and your expertise is and insights in this is so important, and I thank you for just spending the time here and trusting the Fixing Your Eyes platform to do that on your behalf. So thank you to both of you. May you both keep on fixing your eyes on Jesus.
Thank you.
I think for us and for me, I think that it's going to be really important if we're going to move forward for those men who Nicky did refer to before as the ones who are silent, who are neutral, who are egalitarian in their thinking or non-hierarchical. We need you when we plead with you to come forward and to stand up here. We know that you exist. And the church needs you, women need you, men need you, children need you, and please stand for truth. Please don't be afraid. do what is right and good and rally together. I know CBE is a great place to be able to do that in Sydney, and there's CBE chapters around the country. That's a fantastic organisation with international connections, which is really important. We believe at the moment that half the church is being oppressed, and through that, I think the whole church is actually being oppressed. We're not advocating here for a matriarchal society, but we're pushing back against the patriarchal system, which is not what Scripture's advocating for. We need you to be standing for light. But we also need the church themselves to rise and not necessarily accept what they're hearing from the platform. We need to be looking at quotas, which I don't think is always ideal, but I think as a first step, we need quotas. We don't need them to be in favour of men. We need everyone to be like Jesus, and men in power to treat women with respect, to give them dignity and give them voice, to listen to them, be radically different, to work with women, to talk about gifting in the Holy Spirit, and to release the women's giftings. I also want to thank you to those of you who have been praying for us, particularly today, praying for change and praying and championing for the releasing of women's voices. And I want to open the invitation for those of you who need a platform with an egalitarian voice, that you are very welcome to use the Fixing Her Eyes platform. Please email me at fixinghereyes@gmail.com. And there's plenty of resources on this around the web, the www, the whole website. Please look at fixinghereyes.org as a starting point, and we will continue to place resources that we hope and pray will be of use to you on our social media platforms. Now, as referred to earlier, we have many Australian Christian women watching this conversation series, and we know that it's around 1 in 4 whose homes are not safe. Now, Fixing Her Eyes understands domestic and family violence to be a deeply gendered problem and complex. However, Fixing Her Eyes also recognises and stands with victims and survivors where the gender pattern differs. If you are experiencing domestic violence, call the National Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Counselling Service on 1800-RESPECT. If you are in immediate danger in your home, please call 000 if in Australia. Lifeline has a 24-hour crisis line, 13 11 14. To finish, I'm going to read 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. I'm going to read it again. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood. Let that sink in for a moment. A holy nation, God's special possession. God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Amen. Hey, thank you to both of you.
Yeah.
Amen.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks everybody for being here.